Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really plunging into something fundamental, a deep conflict about how we even understand communication itself. We're looking at Gestalt Language Processing, or GLP, and how it clashes with this huge dominant framework, the analytic one that pretty much decides what counts as real language in research, therapy, you name it.
Yeah, it's everywhere.
And the source material for this dive, it's this, well, really powerful piece of writing. It's argumentative, uses personal experience, and it takes aim at the institutional systems themselves. The author basically argues these systems don't just prefer one way of communicating, they actively sort of erase others. And what kicked this whole reflection off is honestly very current. It was an AI.
Right, the AI.
The author, who's obviously deep in GLP research, used their university library's fancy new AI assistant, this thing called Consensus GPT, for a simple search. They just typed in research that affirms Gestalt language processing. Simple enough, right?
You'd think so. But what came back wasn't, a list of studies or anything helpful like that. It was, well, the author calls it an act of institutional gatekeeping.
Okay.
The AI essentially spat out this warning label, almost robotic. It said, and this is pretty much the quote, "While there is some conceptual and anecdotal support for Gestalt language processing in clinical contexts, there is currently no strong empirical evidence validating it as an effective or distinct model of language acquisition."
Oh. No strong empirical evidence. That phrase hits hard.
It really does. And the author points out that specific phrase, no strong empirical evidence, it acts like a gate. Or, as they put it, kind of like a spell.
A spell? How so?
Well, it dictates the terms. It says, unless your way of knowing your evidence can be chopped up, quantified, measured by their existing tools, it's suspect.
So it's immediately pushed aside.
Right. It has to be doubted or marginalized or maybe forced into their framework or, just ignored, like it doesn't really exist in a scientifically meaningful way.
Okay, let's unpack that. This core conflict. Can you define the two sides for us? So first, GLP.
Sure. So GLP, Gestalt Language Processing. The idea here is that language isn't always built brick by brick. For GLP folks, it's acquired through gestalts. Think whole chunks, resonant scripts, phrases that are emotionally charged.
Like grabbing a whole picture instead of assembling pixels.
Exactly. The meaning is in the entire phrase, the tone, the situation it came from. It's holistic.
Okay, and the other side, the dominant one.
That's what the author calls analytic supremacy. And this is like the default setting for almost everything in language research and therapy today.
The default assumption.
Yeah. It assumes language has to be linear, segmented, governed by rules. Meaning is built up systematically, sound to word, part to word to sentence, like Legos.
So you have the whole picture people versus the Lego brick people, systemically speaking?
Kind of, yeah. And the system is built entirely on that Lego model.
So what happens when that system encounters GLP the whole picture way?
Yeah. Basically. Yeah. Short circuits. It doesn't compute. Anything that doesn't fit that neat, linear, piece-by-piece construction, it gets labeled as noise.
Noise. Like static.
Pretty much. Or statistical error. If you don't communicate using their approved building blocks, the system automatically assumes it's not meaningful language. GLP immediately gets shoved into the box labeled alternative hypothesis.
The maybe but probably not box.
Exactly. It's treated like this weird curiosity, maybe a fluke, that has this enormous burden of proof, and it has to prove itself using the other side's tools and rules.
Which brings us to maybe the most powerful idea in the piece. The author flips this on its head and says, I am the null hypothesis. Now wait, that sounds confrontational. For you listening, the null hypothesis in research is basically the default assumption that there's nothing going on, no effect, no relationship, just randomness.
It is confrontational and deeply provocative.
So what does it mean to claim yourself as the null hypothesis? What are the stakes there?
The stakes are, well, everything. Your reality as a communicator. By saying, I am the null hypothesis, the author is basically holding up a mirror to the system. They're saying, this is how you already treat me. You assume I'm an error, a non-phenomenon.
So if GLP is the null, the default assumption is that it's not real communication.
Then the job of the dominant analytic tradition becomes actively disproving it. They have to scientifically demonstrate that this way of communicating using scripts and gestalts isn't actually a valid pattern.
They have to prove it's just an artifact. Random noise.
Precisely. They have to flatten the person's lived experience until it fits their definition of statistical error.
And the tools they use for this disproof, the demands for that strong empirical evidence, they're strict, but they only value what the analytic model values. Is that right?
Absolutely. You're talking controlled studies, operational definitions.
Mm.
A lot of this comes straight from behaviorism, which historically doesn't like messy things like internal states or holistic meaning.
So they measure.
They measure what they can measure easily. Syllables, morphemes, whether the syntax matches standard grammar. Very segmented.
Okay, so here's a key question. What happens if a GLP speaker uses a script, a whole chunk, that's perfectly relevant and meaningful in context? How does the analytic framework handle that?
It gets flagged, often as not generative,
Renee.
meaning it wasn't built piece by piece right now. It's seen as just stored sound, like hitting playback on a recording, not as actively constructed meaning. So its validity as real language gets immediately questioned.
Even if it communicates effectively.
Even then. Because the methodology often demands collapsing the context. To get clean data points, you often have to strip away the emotional resonance, the relationship, the situation, the very things that give the gestalt its meaning for this speaker.
So the soul of it gets lost.
That's what the author argues. They say the soul of Gestalt language is declared unmeasurable, and therefore it must be non-essential. The goal becomes, and this is a direct quote again, to flatten me into a data point so thoroughly abstracted from my living reality that the actual person is unrecognizable in the data.
And this really comes through in how echolalia repeating phrases is treated, right? It's almost always just called mimicry.
Exactly. Simple imitation. Stored sound, not stored meaning. That's the label.
Right.
If a parent or a therapist says, no, when they say that movie line, it means I need help or I'm scared, the system tends to dismiss that insight as anecdotal or adult projection, like seeing shapes in clouds. Because their tools, their metrics weren't designed to capture that kind of meaning, the system defaults to assuming non-meaning.
It's a really powerful form of dismissal, not overt attack, but just defining someone's communication out of existence, like you said, gatekeeping.
Right. Some call it epistemic violence, harming someone intellectually by refusing to recognize their way of knowing or being.
So if the communication resists being neatly measured by their tools, if the meaning is tied up in affect or resonance or the wholeness of the phrase,
it gets declared incoherent, unworthy of serious scientific study. And the author's conclusion on this is stark. GLP isn't erased by force, necessarily. It's erased by footnote.
Wow. Just written out of the rule.
Yeah, a quiet exclusion built into the very definition of evidence.
Now, if this was purely about science, you'd expect new evidence, maybe better methods, to eventually change things. But the source argues pretty strongly that this isn't just science. The pushback against GLP is political, epistemological, ontological. Big words.
They are big words, but the argument is that they fit.
Why ontological about the nature of being?
Because, the author argues, truly affirming GLP wouldn't just be adding a new chapter to a textbook. It would mean dismantling this whole myth of analytic supremacy.
And that myth supports
a massive academic industrial complex. Think research funding, therapy models, assessment tools, professional hierarchies, all built on the assumption that language is analytic, predictable, controllable. Accepting GLP challenges that entire structure. It becomes about who controls the definition of communication, which, often controls the funding and legitimacy.
Okay, so how does this control work? The source does something interesting here. It applies a behaviorist tool to critique the system itself. A functional behavior assessment, an FBA.
Right. Usually you'd use an FBA to figure out why an individual might be engaging in a certain challenging behavior, what triggers it, what the behavior looks like, and what consequence reinforces it.
But here they apply it to the whole system, promoting the analytic view.
Exactly. It's a meta-critique. So the antecedent, the trigger. A world, or maybe a scientific culture, that doesn't tolerate ambiguity. It wants clear, predictable rules.
Okay. The trigger is discomfort with the unknown.
Then the behavior.
Yeah.
Creating a linguistic framework. And the source points heavily towards V.F. Skinner's verbal behavior here that reduces complex human speech down to operant conditioning. Stimulus, response, reinforcement.
Making it predictable and manageable.
Precisely. And the consequence, the payoff that keeps the cycle going. Control. Compliance from individuals being taught. Funding streams for research based on these models. Institutional legitimacy. And the ultimate reinforcement, according to the source, the erasure of voices that do not conform.
That connection to Skinner feels really important. The critique isn't saying operant conditioning isn't real, right? It's about the goal.
Yes. The argument is that Skinner's verbal behavior And the systems that grew from it, like applied behavior analysis, ABA, or discrete trial training, were fundamentally designed to manage language, to shape it into predetermined forms rather than fully understand its natural diversity and internal meaning.
And does the author trace this ambition, this need for control and predictability, further back?
They do. They argue that this behavioral lineage, focused on compliance and normalization, shares a kind of philosophical ancestry with other historical systems.
Like what?
Like systems that sought to institutionalize neurodivergent people, or efforts to suppress deaf culture and signed languages, or the historical boarding schools designed to eradicate indigenous languages. The common thread is the drive towards a single, dominant norm, often enforced through behavioral control.
So when GLP ways of communicating are labeled a delay or called non-functional,
The author argues that this dismissal isn't neutral. It's upholding a particular vision of the world, one stemming from thinkers like Skinner, that prioritizes predictability, perhaps even over individual autonomy. They quote Skinner's own controversial book titles, suggesting the goal was a world without freedom and without dignity, engineered for smooth functioning.
it makes the debate about therapy methods feel much heavier. It's not just about what works in a narrow sense, but what kind of world we're building.
That's exactly the point being made. Is the goal compliance? Or is it supporting genuine, holistic human flourishing, even if it looks different?
And this system, because it focuses so much on beginnings, early intervention, correcting deviations, it seems like it completely misses what GLP can actually become.
Yes. This is where the author steps in not just as a critic, but as living evidence. They identify as an elder GLP.
An elder GLP, offering testimony against the system's pessimism.
Right. The counter-argument is basically, you guys study kids before they get the right kind of support, you see their struggles or their distress in a system not built for them, and you mistake that for the inherent nature of GLP itself.
Yet that's not the whole story.
Not at all. The author points to their own experience as proof that GLP isn't a dead end or a permanent deficit. It's a developmental pathway.
What kind of evidence did they offer?
Concrete examples of adult GLP flourishing. They talk about having progressed through the natural stages of GLP development, being able to improvise complex thoughts, engage in sophisticated conversations. And they give some pretty striking examples of their own output, like being able to deliver a keynote address nearly 4 hours long, full of recursive phrasing and nested reference, and noting that they produced over 60,000 words for a series of essays, starting from just a few initial questions, all built on that foundational Gestalt processing style.
So the fluency, the generativity, the analytic model demands, it is there, just maybe looks different?
It seems so. The argument is that the system is fighting a straw man, a caricature, created by its own limiting tools.
They study beginnings and claim to know the end.
That's the quote. They don't follow GLP individuals long enough, especially not when they're actually understood and supported within a GLP-affirming framework to see the potential realized.
So the conclusion isn't asking for permission to exist.
No, it's defiant. The author states clearly, I am not asking for inclusion. I am refusing extinction. The burden of proof, they argue, was never really on GLP speakers to justify their existence. It's on the dominant system to justify its framework and, frankly, its history of erasure.
This really brings us to a key takeaway for you listening. When any system, whether it's a therapy approach, a research paradigm, maybe even an AI like the one that started this, when it claims scientific neutrality,
I have to dig deeper.
yeah, you have to question its base assumptions. What does it count as real? What does it count as measurable? What kind of knowledge does it value? And what does it inherently dismiss? Because these systems don't just passively measure reality.
They actively shape it.
Uh,
By setting the rules for what counts as valid proof, they dictate whose reality gets acknowledged.
Which is the perfect place to leave you with a final thought, something to really chew on.
The source material doesn't just want us to know about Skinner's theories of behaviorism. It urges us to reckon with his ambitions
No.
by actually reading his more philosophical and honestly more controversial works. Books like Walden 2, his novel about a utopian community engineered through behaviorism, and Beyond Freedom and Dignity.
Okay, so the challenge is, if the frameworks we often rely on, even today, for understanding communication, for therapy, if they descend from a vision that explicitly aimed to engineer away the need for concepts like freedom and dignity in favor of perfect predictability,
How does that change how you look at those practices, even the ones we find helpful?
It forces a really uncomfortable question, doesn't it? Is the ultimate goal management and making people fit the system? Or is it genuinely recognizing and supporting the full, complex, sometimes unpredictable reality of human communication?
Something to think about next time you encounter these frameworks. What assumptions are you bringing to the table?